Good morning, everybody. Chapter 7 today. So basically, what we're going to look at, like it says, is we're going to look at the consumers, the buyers, the producers, and then the efficiency of markets. If you remember what efficiency means, it means like making the pie the biggest possible, right? We'll talk a little bit more about what efficiency means in this chapter, but basically the point of this chapter is, if we look back on the history of what we've done so far, chapter 4, supply and demand curves, right? Where they cross, that's equilibrium, price, and quantity. We learned kind of how that happened. 5 was elasticity. And then 6, last class, was we looked at government policies, right? And how they affected the supply and demand curves and the equilibrium that we learned about in chapter 4, right? And that was chapter 6. One of the things in chapter 6 that we were talking about, or kind of thinking about, was do these government policies that are enacted, do they make the marketplace better off? Do they make it worse off? What's the effect on the consumers and the producers in the market, right? And we had kind of looked at it and we kind of said, well, when government imposes, actually review, what are the 3 types of ways that that we learned about that government can interfere in the marketplace? Do you remember what taxes is one of them, price floors, and price ceilings. Okay, so those were the 3 ways that the government can get involved in the marketplace and kind of, quote, mess up the normal supply and demand curve. And so we'd ask, like, is this good? Is this bad when the government gets involved? Like, what exactly happens? And we didn't really have a real good way to quantify, like, how good or how bad the outcome was. We just looked at the fact that when you impose a tax or when you impose a price ceiling, there's either a decrease in quantity or there's a shortage or there's something that we know is bad, right? In this chapter, what we're going to do is we're going to develop kind of more of a complicated framework, or not complicated, but a concrete framework for determining, hey, is this a bad outcome or is this outcome better than the previous one, okay? And so that's kind of what we're going to do in this chapter. So we'll look at the answers to these questions. What's consumer surplus, okay? And this is kind of like how good the trade is for the consumers. We're going to develop this concept. And then how is it related to the demand curve? We'll do the same thing for the sellers, of course, because we want to see how good the participation in the marketplace is for sellers. We call that producer surplus. And how is it related to the supply curve? And then finally, do markets all on their own, remember the supply and demand curve crossing that we learned about in chapter 4, if we just leave it alone all by itself, call it a marketplace, does that produce a desirable allocation of resources? Or is it better? Could we improve upon the market outcome if we have the government get involved in maybe one of those 3 ways that we talked about earlier? Okay, so that's the question we'll be asking today. Okay, so basically what I've been talking about this whole time is this thing called welfare economics. So welfare economics, what we're asking about is, this is not welfare like cash transfers from the government to poor people welfare, right? Or to low-income individuals welfare, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about welfare like how are people faring, right? How are people doing? Are they faring well? Are they doing well, right? So welfare economics directly asks the question, does the market's allocation of resources, does it make people fare well? Right? Okay. Are people okay with the market's allocation of resources? What is the allocation of resources? What does that mean again? Okay, the 3 things. How much of each good is produced, which producers produce it, and which consumers consume it. Right? And so the remarkable thing, in the marketplace all by itself, right, it determines a price and a quantity from the intersection of the supply and demand curves, but there's so much information inside that marketplace. It determines quantity, how much of each good will produce, but it also determines who are going to produce it and who's going to consume it. Okay? Recall, along a demand curve, well, here's a supply and a demand curve, right? If this is the quantity, right, there's a bunch of demanders all the way down to here, right? These are all demanders. Not everybody gets the good. Do you see that? All right? And so somebody's got to make a decision who gets the good, these people up here, and who does not get the good, these people down here, right? The marketplace does it all by itself, but there might be another way to think about handing out the good or rationing the good, right? Okay. And so that's the allocation of resources. So basically, once again, welfare economics It's not studying cash transfers from the government to low-income people. That's not that kind of welfare. Different kind of welfare. How the allocation of resources affects economic well-being, right? Boom, we have a marketplace. We have buyers and sellers. They reach a market price and a market quantity. Did that make the people in the marketplace better or worse? That's welfare economics. That's what we're going to study today. And really, we're going to use this chapter from here on out, because from now on, we're going to look at, in chapter, for example, 10 or chapter 11, we're going to look at a certain type of good, a road or a school, a public good. And we're going to say, is the marketplace better off or worse off with this good? And so we're going to work with this foundation of welfare economics to kind of like test and see how people are doing. Because ultimately, that's what we want. We want better outcomes for everybody. Okay? So let's look at the well-being of the consumers first, and then we'll do the producers in a little bit. Okay, so consumers. We have to think about, in order to think about how happy they are to be buying something in the first place, we have to think about this concept, WTP, willingness to pay. Right? In order to know how happy you are to buy a hamburger, I have to know how willing you were to pay for that hamburger in the first place. Okay? And so it's very simple. It's just the maximum amount the buyer will pay for that good. This is not the actual amount the buyer pays. Okay, this is not. This is just like the maximum amount the buyer would pay. And why is this interesting? Because if I were to look at you and I were to ask one person, how much are you willing to pay for a hamburger? And one person says $3. And I ask for somebody else, how much are you willing to pay for a hamburger? And they say $73. Well, this tells me something about the difference in the people, right? Either this guy really loves hamburgers, right? So he'd be really happy if he got a hamburger, and if we only have one, he should get the hamburger, right? Or he's starving to death, in which case he'd be really happy if he got a hamburger, so if we only had one, he should get the hamburger, right? So the willingness to pay is a signal to us that we can say, like, oh, how good is the market outcome if we look at the willingness to pay? So the key, just like I was saying, it values how much the buyer values the good, right? So this guy over here values a hamburger at $73. He values it a lot. For whatever reason, we don't have to know why he values it at $73. We just need to know that he has a really huge desire for this product. All right? So let's imagine we have these 4 people, and they're going to buy an iPod. Right? Anybody recognize these 4 people? This has nothing to do with economics. Red Hot Chili Peppers. Good job. And so anyway, so the 4 members of Red Hot Chili Peppers are wanting to buy an iPod. We have different willingness to pay. This is true in real life, right? In real life, we all pay the same amount for the same iPod because we just go to the Apple store, right, and buy the same amount. But it is not true that everybody values the iPod the same, right? This guy maybe is addicted to music, or maybe he has really long car drives and he needs something to listen to, or something, right? This guy, maybe he doesn't like music as much, or maybe he doesn't have as much income, or for whatever reason he doesn't value the iPod that much. Okay, so what can we do? We can actually determine a demand curve from it by asking this question. If the price is blank, how many people would buy this iPod? Right? This is a really simple question. So you would tell me, if the price is 200, who will buy an iPod, and what's the quantity demanded? Yeah, who's going to buy it? And Flea, right. So it'll be 2. Why won't Chad and John buy it? Yeah, it's not necessarily, like, perhaps these guys could afford it. Perhaps they could, right? But it's like, the happiness I get from an iPod is only up to $125. If I were to measure my happiness in dollar value, right, it would be up to $125. And the cool thing is, we don't have to actually, in economics, calculate some conversion factor from happiness units to dollar units. We don't have to. All we do is we look at the purchases that people buy, and we say that, oh, somewhere in their brain, they decided that up to $125 they value this iPad, right? So if I were to ask this person, hey, would you buy an iPod for $120? They'd say, yep, 124, yep, 125, yep, 126, no. I'm like, oh, well, in his brain, he values an iPod. The happiness of his iPod can be converted to $125. It's very simple, right? Okay, so these guys say no, these guys say yes. Very good. That's what you got. Okay, so quantity demanded equals 2 when price equals 200. Quantity demanded equals 2 when price equals 200. Right? Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Try to do this on your own, then I'll give you the answers. All right, take 60 seconds. Say, hey, when the iPod costs 300 and up, who buys it and what's the quantity demanded? And then if I drop the price anywhere between 251 to 300, who buys it and how many people is it? All right, try to fill it out real quick, and then I'll reveal the answers in 2 seconds. Okay, so if the price so we'll go ahead and derive the demand schedule. Remember these, right? Demand schedule, we learned this back in chapter 4. It just takes all the information from demanders and it puts it in a table form, right? And then after we put it in a table, what do we always do? The next step is make a demand curve after the demand schedule, right? So we'll do the same thing here. But first, let's do the demand schedule. If the price is 301 and up, who buys it? Nobody, right? And so quantity demanded, very good, 0. All right, if it's somewhere in here, who buys it? Only Flea, right? He's the only guy who values it that much. And what's so what's the total quantity demand? 1. Okay, if it's somewhere in here, 176 to 250, who buys it? Anthony and Flea, right? Exactly. So the price is in here, and you might be like, oh, well, Anthony will buy it. Well, also Flea will too, because he's willing to pay up to 300 bucks. So if you make him pay anywhere in here, he'll for sure buy it, right? So Anthony and Flea, and the quantity demand will be 2, right? If we drop the price here, who's going to buy it? Chad, Anthony, and Flea, right? Because all of these guys have that willingness to pay is higher than that. Quantity demand is 3. And then, of course, if we have super low price, everybody's going to buy it, right? Okay, and the quantity demand is 4. Everybody understood how I did that? Okay, so exactly the same as we did way back in chapter 4, we derived a demand schedule. Remember that was for like Helen's demand for lattes or something like way back then, right? We did that. Then we went and we plotted a demand curve with it. Let's do the same thing here, okay? So we'll do a demand curve. So when price is 301 and up, 0 quantity, so I just draw the line here, right, at 0 quantity and then the price. Does everybody see that? Okay, but now I hit 300, and as soon as I hit 300, I pop out to quantity demanded equals 1, right? So I just pop out to quantity demanded equals 1, and then how far down do I go? I go down to 251. So I'm going to go down to 251. There we go. I go down to 251 and I stop. Right? And then at the second I hit 250, 2 people pop in, right? So I go ahead and jump out to 2. See, quantity demand equals 2. And then I come all the way down, 276, right there. At 175, I pop out to the third person. The third person comes in at 175 because they're like, oh, I'm going to buy this, right? These are all just like hypothetical prices. This is not the actual price, right? This is just like if the price were blank, then how many people would buy it, right? And so then I keep lowering the price until I get to 126. If the price hits 125, a 4th guy jumps in right here. So I jump out to 4. And then, of course, there's only 4 total people. So even if I keep lowering the price, I can't get more buyers, right? Because it's a very small marketplace. So it looks like that. Okay? Sort of looks like a demand curve, yes? Kind of. We have price, quantity. We have sort of a downward sloping thing going on here. Okay? We got this directly from the demand schedule. Okay? Now, here's a very important point I would like to make. This gives us another way to think about demand curves. Okay? Previously, we had thought of, let me draw a demand curve here. The way I taught you a demand curve originally was, oh, when price is $10, Q people are going to want to purchase the good, right? But now there's another way to think about it, thinking about the willingness to pay idea I just taught you guys. You can say, oh, person number Q, what's the maximum amount he's willing to pay? $10, right? So I can actually directly read anybody's willingness to pay off of this demand curve, right? If Justin is right here, if this is Justin, I'm like, how much is Justin, me, how much am I willing to pay for the iPod? Well, I just go up to the demand curve, and then whatever this is, P dollars, that's how much Justin's willing to pay for the product. Okay, so there's 2 ways to think about a demand curve now. You can say at any price, here's the amount of people who want to do it, or for person number blank, here's how much they're willing to pay. Yeah, kind of interesting. Okay, so one thing hopefully you'll notice is that this demand curve and most demand curves I draw are pretty straight. This thing is not straight. It's got what we call staircase shape, right? So where's the staircase bumps coming from? Where's the staircase bumps coming from? Right, right. So it comes from the number of buyers. Every time the price changes, well, sometimes when the price changes, another person jumps into the marketplace, right? And so the steps come from one per buyer. So basically one way to think about it is every buyer has his own individual step. We call it their willingness to pay, right? Their willingness to pay. Guy number 4's willingness to pay is this step, which is was that like 125 or something like that? Okay, so that's just because this example had 4 people. If there were a bunch of people, a huge number, as in a competitive marketplace, remember in a competitive marketplace I say there's so many buyers and so many sellers, right? It's going to have a bunch of little tiny steps, one for every single buyer, right? And then it would kind of look like a smooth curve. Does that make sense? So in this demand curve is actually, because this is maybe in the thousands of people, right? This demand curve itself is actually a bunch of little tiny small stair steps. But when I zoom all the way out, I can't see the individual stair steps. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the idea from where the stair steps come from, and how we get from staircase to flat curve. Okay. Now, here is a key concept that you have to know, and this word in purple here, you have to know what it means. Okay? So for any Q that you pick, the height of the demand curve at that Q is the WTP of the marginal buyer. So what is the marginal buyer? It's like the last guy who will buy it, and if I raise the price anymore, that guy leaves and says, no, I don't want it anymore. Okay? The marginal buyer. Think of like the margin on your piece of paper. The margin is like the edge, right? It's like the guy on the edge who's not going to buy anymore if you change the price, make it higher. Okay? So at any quantity, the height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay of that last guy, right? So if I at quantity 3, if I want to know the WTP of the marginal buyer, well, first I have to ask which guy is the marginal buyer. Well, at quantity equals 3, the marginal buyer is guy number 3, just the third guy. Okay, what's his WTP? Well, I go up to the height of the demand curve, and I get, what is that, like 175 or something like that? And that tells me right away how much he's willing to pay. Okay? Just like I was saying over here, it's the new way to think of the demand curve. Now we have 2 ways to think of the demand curve. Okay? So if you look, guy number 1, well, we call that, he was flea, right? So his willingness to pay is up here. And then guy number 2, that was, who was that, Anthony, I think? Yeah, that's his willingness to pay up there, 250. Guy number 3, marginal buyer number 3 was Chad. And then guy number 4 is John, and he was willing to pay 125. Whoops. He's willing to pay 125. Right? So the height of the demand curve is the WTP for that last buyer. We call him the marginal buyer. We're going to use that word a lot in this class, marginal. Right? All right, so let's we have everything in place to develop this idea that's called consumer surplus. And this is actually our measure of happiness or welfare. We just needed the other WTP thing to talk about it. Okay. So consumer surplus, it's simple to calculate. It's the amount a buyer is willing to pay minus the amount the buyer actually pays. This makes sense. WTP minus the price I pay. If I'm willing to pay $200 for something and I only have to pay $150, I'm pretty happy. How happy am I? I have $50 worth of happiness left over in my heart. That's consumer surplus. So I'm going to put up the WTPs here. Right? And remember, these WTPs is not how much the people will actually pay, right? Because they don't actually pay their WTP. They pay whatever the market price is, right? And so the difference between that is the dollar value worth of happiness, right? Because the whole point here, we're trying to do welfare economics. We're trying to see how happy people are from buying and selling. Well, how on earth do you measure happiness, right? So we're going to take kind of a shortcut. We're going to say, oh, we just assign it a dollar value. And how do we assign it a dollar value? We'll just say it's the number of dollars between the maximum they would pay, the WTP, and the price they had to pay. And we'll call that their happiness from having the product. Okay? So let's suppose the price is $260. Okay? First of all, who buys it, and what's the consumer surplus going to be? Well, Flea is the only person who's going to buy it at $260. You see it? And nobody else values it, right? But how happy is Flea to have an iPod? How happy is he to have an iPod? What's his consumer surplus? $40, right? He's willing to pay up to $300. The market made him pay $260. So he has some happiness left over in his heart of $40. That's called consumer surplus, right? It's kind of like an abstract concept. That's why I'm presenting it this way. It's like the happiness left over in your heart after you make a purchase, right? Okay. And so this is awesome, right? He's $40 happier than he would have been without an iPod. Okay. The others don't get a consumer surplus at all, right? Because they didn't buy an iPod, right? If we had forced them to buy an iPod, they'd actually have negative consumer surplus. You guys see that? They would actually be worse off. If I forced this guy to buy an iPod for $260, he's like not super happy. He's actually going to have a negative value of consumer surplus. Okay? So the total consumer surplus for the entire marketplace, this is simple because there's only one guy buying, is just the consumer surplus of that one guy. It's $40, right? If other people were buying, well, there would be other consumer surplus, but simple example, there's not. Everybody understand? Now, if I change the price, let's look at this graphically first from the demand curve. So here's the demand curve. It's staircase step, right? Remember, how much was his consumer surplus? It was $40. So we calculate it mathematically. We can also calculate it from the graph. Check it out. Let's put a price level of $200. Or no, not 200. Sorry, $260, right? And then his consumer surplus is that $40. It also is the area of this box right here, right? It's one wide, one individual wide, times how many dollars high? $40 high. So 40 times 1 is 40. So you can get it geometrically from the graph as well, instead of doing the subtraction. Okay? And sometimes this is much easier. And so the total consumer surplus is $40 because there's only one person, Flea, in the marketplace. Okay? Now, let's suppose that the price falls to $220. Okay? What's going to change here? The price is $220. What do you immediately see? It's going to change. More people are going to buy, right? In fact, how many people are going to buy? Exactly how many people are going to buy? 2, right? Flea and Anthony. Now, notice something about Flea. Let's just think about Flea and the happiness he's getting. Before he was getting $40 worth of happiness, right? Now, is he getting more or less happiness? He's getting more happiness because it's cheaper, right? Any of us, if the price goes down on something, you know it. You've felt it before. You get happier, right? If it's something that you're always buying and it gets cheaper, you're like, score, right? So Flea's consumer surplus is now $80, right? It's $80 high from 300 to 220, and it's 1 wide. 80 times 1 is 80, right? Okay, but is that the total market consumer surplus now? No, because there's another guy we have to look at, and it's going to be Anthony. So let's look at him. How much happiness does he have in his heart from after buying this iPod? $30. So we'll say that Anthony's consumer surplus is $30. Right? I could do the math over here, or I could look and see this square is 30 high, and it's 1 wide. 30 times 1 is 30. Okay? So the total consumer surplus in the marketplace is, what is that? 110. So I can look at it either way. I can add these up, or I can find the area of these 2 squares. Okay? Either way. Questions on how we're finding consumer surplus, right? So now I can definitively say that at a sale price of $220, the customers are $110 happier than they would have been if they couldn't make the trade, right? If they couldn't be in the marketplace at all, if they couldn't purchase the product, right? We can definitively say something about it. We can say that the consumers are $110 happier when the price is $220. Their happiness totally depends on the price. Do you see that? The happiness changes as the price changes. And this, by the way, is just the happiness of the consumers. We call that consumer surplus. We'll get to the happiness of the sellers later on. Okay? Okay, so basically, here's the summary. Just remember this. If you don't remember anything else I said today, it's this. The consumer surplus equals the area under the demand curve and above the price, under the demand curve, above the price, from 0 to Q. Under the demand curve, above the price, from 0 to Q. So it's always going to be kind of this area up here in the upper left-hand corner of the graph. Okay. Now, let's go to something maybe perhaps a little more that you're more used to. Let's do a smooth demand curve, right? So if I have a smooth demand curve, that means I'm actually having like thousands or millions of buyers, right? Because a smooth demand curve is just a bunch of little tiny steps and then I zoom out, right? So if I have a smooth demand curve, that means I have a ton of buyers, okay? So let's say that this is the demand for shoes and 0, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. This is in thousands, right? It has to be a huge number, okay? So it's in thousands. Right here, we got the price per pair of shoes because I'm representing the market for shoes, and so I'm going to have a demand curve for shoes. Let's throw a demand curve on there, okay? And let's see. At quantity equals 5, remember this is 5,000 because this is in thousands, right? Okay, who's the marginal buyer at quantity equals 5,000? It's guy number 5,000 on here, right? The marginal buyer is just guy number 5,000, right? There's 4,999 other people that are buying, right? And they're represented by all of these steps. You can't see the steps, but there's little steps in here for each person, right? There's 4,999 steps, and then guy number 5,000th's step is how high? $50. Which means that if I were to ask you, what's the, at Q equals 5, what's the marginal buyer's WTP? $50. How do I translate that into normal talk, right? The 5,000th guy, what's the maximum amount he's willing to pay? Well, you just go up to the demand curve. He's willing to pay a maximum of $50, right? Guy number 4,080, I don't know, some guy over here, you know for a fact his WTP is slightly higher. You don't know what it is without actually looking at the demand curve, right? But you know it's got to be somewhere higher than 50. Okay? All right. So let's suppose that price equals 30. What is the consumer surplus of this guy, number 5,000? If the price is 30. What's the consumer surplus of this guy? 20 bucks. Okay? But, and that was easy. I just said 50, how much he's willing to pay, $30, price of shoe. He's like, oh, yeah, I have shoes and I have $20 worth of happiness left over in my heart. We call it consumer surplus. Is that the total consumer surplus for the entire marketplace, though? No. Because I have how many people buying shoes right now? At price equals 30, how many people are buying shoes? 15,000, right? So go ahead and take this time. I'll give you about, I don't know, 2 minutes to go and calculate all 15,000. No, I'm just kidding, right? There's 15,000 consumer surpluses that I would have to calculate if I want to do the add up method, right? So I'll show you the easier way to do it instead of adding up all 15,000 people, okay? Here's what you do. Remember, it's the area between price and the demand curve from 0 to Q. So it's the area under the demand curve above the price from 0 to Q. So I know that the consumer surplus for all 15,000 people is going to be captured by this area here, right? It's going to be way too hard to calculate the height of everybody's consumer surplus 15,000 times. This is much simpler, right? I know it's this area, okay? Do I have somewhere back in my brain the area of a triangle somewhere? Can I calculate this area? Is this possible to do? Yeah. What is it? 1/2 base times height, right? That's convenient. Okay, it's convenient. So I just go 1/2 base times height. Obviously, this only works with a smooth demand curve, right? If it's curvy or something like that, it's not going to be a triangle anymore. You're going to have to use calculus. But don't worry about it. I just give you smooth ones in this class. 1/2 base times height. So what's the height of this triangle? 30. What's the base? 15,000, right? So 15 times 30 times 1/2 is 225,000, right? So total happiness in this market is $225,000, right? Because there's 1,000 people. Or, I mean, there's thousands of people. Does that make sense how we did that? Much simpler than adding it up for all 15,000 people. Okay. So now, this is helpful. We have an answer to the question that says, when price is 30, how much better off, what's the welfare of the consumers? And you can definitively say it's 225,000, right? Participation in this marketplace is making them better by 225,000, quote, dollars of happiness in their heart than if they weren't able to buy shoes at all. Does that make sense? Those of you who like to buy shoes, you understand, I think, what I'm saying, right? If you were told you're not allowed to buy shoes, you're missing out that happiness in your heart that you would get otherwise. Okay. Now, let's talk about, remember earlier I said that consumer surplus is directly related to the price. If you change the price, it changes consumer surplus, right? So if I raise the price, this is easy. What's going to happen to the happiness in people's heart? They're not so much happiness in their heart, right? Not quite as much warm and fuzzy feeling. So let's say the price rises to $40, okay? First of all, just by eyeballing it, you can see that this triangle is going to be the new consumer surplus, and it's smaller than the old one, right? So let's go ahead and calculate that. It's 20 high, it's 10 long, so 1/2, 20 times 10 is 200, times 1/2 is 100. So we've got $100,000 of consumer surplus when the price rises to 40. Okay. Now, why is that number less? What happened here? Why are we losing consumer surplus? Tell me. There's one piece, and it's that fewer people are willing to buy the product. Exactly, right? At 30, how many people were buying? 15,000, right? Now at 40, how many people are buying? Only 10,000, right? So there are 5,000 people who no longer want to buy the product or can no longer afford it, and they're losing out on that happiness in their heart. That's one reason, okay? And so the first reason is, that's what you just said. Whoops, I have too many clicks. The consumer surplus falling due to buyers leaving the market, right? Exactly what you just said. Fewer people are willing to buy this now, and so this little triangle goes away because people are leaving the market. What's this? This is getting removed. What's that represent? So it's from people 0 to 10,000. They're still staying in the marketplace, right? Even with the higher price, they'll still buy it, right? This is the fall in consumer surplus due to the remaining buyers paying the higher P. So these guys from 0 to 10,000 are like, okay, even with this higher price, I'll still stay, but I don't have as much happiness in my heart from purchasing the product as I had before, right? So there's the two reasons. These guys say buy and don't buy the product anymore, so they lose happiness. These guys still buy the product, but they don't have as much happiness in their heart. And together, that's the difference between the old consumer surplus, which was big, and the new consumer surplus, which is small. All right. Let's have you guys calculate this. So here's a demand curve. All right, you can think of this in thousands if you want, or you can just think of this as regular numbers just to make the math easier. Okay? But note that if it's a smooth demand curve, you know that in reality it has to have a lot of consumers. But to make the math easier, you can just keep this as like 15 and 20 and stuff. Find the marginal buyer's WTP when quantity equals 10. Okay? So at quantity equals 10, you got to figure out who's the marginal buyer, what's his WTP, find the consumer surplus when price equals 30, and then price will fall to 20. I want to know how much consumer surplus will increase due to new people entering the market and existing buyers paying lower price. Okay? You may want to get together with a buddy to do this one. Take about 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll come back to you. Okay, let's do some answers. At quantity equals 10, right, The marginal buyer is guy number 10, right? It's the last guy, right? And his WTP is simply $30, right? Does that mean that everybody from 0 to 10, their WTP is only $30? No. All of these guys down here actually have higher WTPs. It's only this guy, number 10, we call him the marginal buyer, that has a WTP of 30. Okay, and then what's the total consumer surplus at this price? Well, 1/2 base times height. The height is 10. The distance is 10, right? So 10 times 10 is 100 times 1/2 is 50. Okay? So if the price is 20, if the price is 30, the total happiness comes to the consumers is $50. Okay? Now, price falls to 20, so right away I know what's going to happen to consumer surplus. Are people going to be happier or less happy when the price falls? Happier, right? They're consumers, they buy stuff. Okay, so let's break it up into the two pieces. Now, I know the total new consumer surplus is going to be this big, huge triangle here, right? I know it goes from this small triangle to this big triangle, right? But there's two reasons for the increase in consumer surplus. The first one is this. When the price was 30, only 10 people were buying it. Then when the price dropped to 20, 20 people started buying it, right? So person number 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, they were never in the marketplace, but now they are, right? So they're bringing some happiness into the marketplace, okay? And that's the area of this triangle here. This is the increase that comes just from the new buyers. And it's 50 right here. Okay? The increase that comes just from the new buyers. Okay? But there's other happiness increase going on here. And it's guys 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. People who are always buying, right? But now get to buy it at a cheaper price. Does that make sense? So they get to buy, they used to have to pay 30. They're still going to buy it, but they get to pay 20 now. So they're way happier. So that's this area right here, right? There's $10 worth of happiness that each person additionally gets times 10 people. That's 100. Okay? We don't multiply that by 1/2 because it's not a triangle. It's a rectangle. Okay? Does that make sense? So please know how to do this on the test. I will almost certainly ask you, I will give you consumer surplus. I'll either have the price go up or down, and then I'll ask you, hey, this change, break it into the two parts. Which part of the change is from new buyers, and which part of this change is from old buyers that are happier? Okay? Certainly know how to do this. All right, so now we're going to think about the producer side of the market. So we had done the consumers. We talked about when they're better off and if they're happier from being in the marketplace. They're not the only participants in the marketplace, right? There's also the producers. So let's examine kind of the happiness, quote, of the producers now. All right? Before we do that, we have to think about cost. So what does this mean? Well, cost is the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good. This is a very specific definition of cost. Please do not get mixed up. Sometimes I say cost, and people are like, oh, I go into the store and the milk costs $5 or something like that. That's not this kind of cost, right? We call that the price. The price is the market value of the exchanged product. Cost, on the other hand, is when the seller produces a product, everything the seller must pay in order to produce that product is his cost. Okay? So it includes all of the resources, all of the inputs, and it also includes the value of the seller's time in cost. Remember, that's called the opportunity cost. So let's say that there are 3 people in the lawn cutting business. Okay. So, anybody recognize these 3 people this time? This one's a lot harder. It's from when I was a kid. Probably not. There's a TV show called Three's Company. And these were the 3 people. It's like from when I was a kid. And even when I was a kid, it was like in reruns when I was a kid. So it's really old. But anyway, It's kind of like the old version of Friends, okay? So, I don't know. Now even Friends is sort of old, but yeah. Before...
Friends is ours.
Yeah, what's that? Exactly. So when I was growing up, the old cool show was Three's Company. Now you're growing up, the old cool show is Friends. So same thing. Okay, but anyways, I digress. This is, but we're going to pretend these three people are lawn mowing companies, lawn mowers. Okay? And so Jack costs $10. What does that mean his cost is $10? That means for him to go and mow your lawn, it costs him $10 as the producer or as the firm, okay? These are not the consumers anymore. Remember, we're on the producer side of the market. We're on the firm side. We're not thinking about consumers right now. Okay, so this cost, this is not how much he's selling his lawn mowing skills for either, right? Okay, this is just how much it costs him to cut a lawn. This is going to include the cost of oil and gas for his lawnmower, if he hires someone, maybe something like that, and it will also include the opportunity cost of his time. You see that there are differences in the price, in the costs for each of these producers. Probably a lot has to do with opportunity cost of time, right? Maybe Chrissy has a job in which she can make $35 an hour. So if she goes and mows the yard, she has to give up her $35 an hour job, whereas this guy only has a job where he can make $10 an hour. So if he goes and mows the lawn, he only has to give up this $10 job. Does that make sense? What's going on here? So this is not the cost that they would charge you to mow your lawn. This is just how much it costs them in order to do it. Okay, so this is kind of a no-duh point, but I'll point it out. A seller will produce and sell the good only if the price exceeds his or her cost, right? So if you offered this guy $9 to mow your yard, would he mow your yard? No. If you offered him 12, would he mow your yard? Yes. Okay. So we're going to call the cost the willingness to sell. Right? On the consumer side, we had the willingness to pay or the willingness to buy, right? WTP. Here on this side, we're going to have the willingness to sell. Okay. So let's go ahead and do the supply schedule. Of course, then we'll do a supply curve. But I want you guys to go ahead and draw this down. Here's the three people. And then if I offer them between $0 and $9, who will cut grass and how many people will there be? So go ahead and do that real quick. All right. So if you were to offer these people anywhere between $0 and $9, who's going to mow it? No one, right? So 0. If you were to offer them between $10 and $19, who's going to mow it? Just Jack, right? If you're going to offer them between $20 and $34, how many people? Jack and Janet. And if you offer people more than $35, we'll have Jack, Janet, and Chrissy. That's 3. Make sense? Okay. Now, after we take the schedule, what's the next thing we always do? Draw the curve with it, right? So let's go ahead and draw the curve. So on this side, price is going up, right? So $0 to $9. So anywhere from $0 to $9, I'm going to have quantity equals 1. So the line is going to be vertically here until we get to $9, right? And then when I get to $10, it comes out at 1 seller, right? And then it continues up. And then it goes over to 2 up until $34. At 34, it comes up and it continues up like that. Okay? So this portion right here is this guy. This portion right here from 10 to 19 is this piece right here. This portion from 20 to 34 is this piece right here. And this portion from 35 and up at quantity equals 3 is this piece right here. Right? And this keeps going up continually. It never keeps going over because in our simple model, there's only 3 sellers, right? So the quantity can never be more than 3 because there's only 3 people providing the good. So even if the price went up infinitely, right? So hey, look, this looks exactly like a supply curve, right? The only difference is the shape, right? Looks like a bunch of steps. So we can use the same kind of reasoning that we did for the demand curve, but use it for the supply curve. So check this out. at each quantity, the height of the supply curve is the cost of the marginal seller, meaning that last seller, right? The seller who would leave the marketplace if the price were any lower. Okay, so look, at quantity equals 2, who's the marginal seller? Person number 2, right? And what is their willingness to sell? It's this right here, $20, right? So we just go up to the height of the supply curve. That tells us they're willing to sell, or their costs, right? Okay. Same sort of interpretation as from the demand curve. So there we see Jack's cost. At quantity equals 1, Jack is the marginal seller. His cost is 10. At quantity equals 2, Janet is the marginal seller, and her cost is 20. And at quantity equals 3, Chrissy is the marginal seller, and hers was, I think, $35 her cost. So now let's transition to the producer surplus. Okay? Producer surplus is the amount a seller has paid for a good minus the seller's costs. Right? Imagine that you're a seller now. This is always harder for my students because we're used to being buyers. We're not really used to being sellers. But imagine you're a seller. Right? However much you get paid minus your costs, that's how much money you get to stick with, right? So that's your, quote, like, profit or your happiness from being in the marketplace, right? We'll call that producer surplus. This is a lot, I think, easier to understand because it's an actual physical quantity of dollars, right? Consumer surplus, there's not actually really dollars. It's just kind of like the happiness in their heart. That's a dollar value, right? But producer surplus is an actual quantity of dollars, right? Somebody pays them P dollars to do the good. They get rid of their costs because they have to pay their costs to someone else. And the money that they're able to stick with, that's their producer surplus. It is an actual quantity of dollars. Okay, so, whoops. If I want to calculate producer surplus at price is 25, okay, how many people are going to sell this product if price equals 25? How many? 2, right? Very good. And so Jack, he's got his producer surplus of what? Well, his costs are $10, right? He's getting 25 bucks, so how much does he left with at the end of the day? 15, right? And so this is an actual quantity of dollars. You can kind of think about it as profits, right? The money he gets minus his costs. And we'll call that producer surplus. Okay? So once again, whereas consumer surplus is kind of this abstract, ephemeral concept of happiness in your heart, producer surplus is actually hard, fast cash in their hand at the end of the day. Okay? But he's not the only guy who's happy from being in this marketplace. Who's the next person who's happy from being in this marketplace? Janet, right? And the exact amount of happiness she has is $5. Why? Because someone's paying her $25 and it costs her $20, so she's got $5 extra of producer surplus. Okay? This is the way we measure the welfare of the producers in the market. Okay? This is the way we measure the welfare of the producers in the market, how the producers are doing. Does Chrissy have a producer surplus? No, not at price equals 25. Why not? Because she can't sell. Right? She refuses to sell. She's like, there's no way I'm going to mow a yard for 20 bucks, but it cost me $25 to mow the yard. Right? Okay. So there's Chrissy's producer surplus is 0. So the total producer surplus in the whole marketplace is $20. Right? So I can also get that graphically. I can add it up mathematically just by adding each individual person. I can also get it graphically. Right? Same thing that I do for consumer surplus. So it's pretty nice. So here's the key. Producer surplus is above the supply curve, below the price, from 0 to Q. Above the supply curve, below the price, from 0 to Q. That's producer surplus. Okay? If you don't remember anything else that I said in the last couple slides, just remember that little box. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at this with a lot of sellers. Now remember, the supply curve we just drew looks kind of like this because there were only a couple of sellers, right? But one of our assumptions for a competitive marketplace, there's bunches of sellers, right? So there's actually going to be a bunch of little tiny stair steps which ends up just kind of looking like a smooth supply curve, right? And so that's what we've gone over here. So now we're going to put the marketplace for shoes again, just like last example, except that this is going to be from the perspective of the sellers, the producers, okay? Once again, quantity, got to be in a big number because that's how we get a smooth supply curve, okay? Price per pair of shoes, and this is how much people are willing to provide, right? So if you ask, hey, guy number 10,000, right? What's his marginal willingness to sell? It's like, what's that, like $25 or something like that? That means that if you offered him less than $25, he won't sell. But if you offered him more than $25, yes, he'll sell products on the marketplace. Okay, let's suppose that price equals 40, right? So suppose the sellers, they just show up to the flea market and they say, okay, if you want to sell shoes, you can only sell them for $40. Suppose that happens, right? Because remember, these sellers don't get to set their own price because it's still a competitive marketplace. So no one gets to set their price. They just get told what the price is. So at Q equals 15,000, what's the marginal, right? The marginal cost for the guy is 30, right? Okay. And so what's producer surplus for her? Well, it costs her 30. She's able to sell for 40. So it's $10, right? But of course, this would be a big hassle because there's actually how many total people buying shoes? What is that? 25,000 people buying shoes. So you don't want to have to add up this for every single person, right? So what's the trick that we'll use? Well, we realize that producer surplus is the area below the price, above supply, from 0 to Q. So it's the area of this triangle here. Yeah? We know the formula for a triangle, which is what? 1/2 base times height. So we go ahead and look at the height. It's what? It's from 15 to 40. That's 25. And then what's the base? 0 to 25. And so 1/2 times 25 times 25 is $312.5 thousand, right? Because this is in thousands once again. Okay. So now we can definitively say that the producers are better off from being in this marketplace. Their welfare has increased. And I can tell you exactly how much their welfare has increased, $312.5. And if those are all their costs, we can definitively say they're making $312.5 thousand in profits. That's producer surplus. Okay, so it's our measurement on how good the producers are doing. All right, now think about price changes, because changing price changes producer surplus. And now we're going to think about a lower price. But this time, is a lower price good or bad? When you're the seller, when you're a seller, is a lower price good or bad? It's bad, right? As the price goes down, this is bad for you as a seller, okay? So the lower price is going to make producer surplus go down, right? How are the buyers feeling about this lower price? What are the buyers thinking about this lower price? Yeah, they're good, right? We're not going to think about them right now, although if we were, they're happier. The happiness is going down for the producers, though, because the price is going down. Okay, so if the price falls to 30, notice the new producer surplus will be this triangle right here. You see this? This smaller triangle. And there's two reasons why it shrunk, right? The new amount is 112.5. So it went from 312.5 to 112.5? I forget. Hang on, let me go back a slide. Yeah, 312.5 to 112.5. So it went down by $200 total, right? So the area of this whole thing right here, this is all the lost producer surplus, is $200. It's going away. But now what are the two reasons for the decrease? It's the same as what we did with the producers, or the consumers, right? The first reason that the profits or the happiness is going away is that At 40, 25,000 people could afford to be selling, right? But at 30, only 15,000 can afford to be selling, right? So 10,000 people just dropped out of the selling marketplace, right? 10,000 sellers stopped their selling activities. And so that's captured here. This is all the happiness or the profit that used to come to those sellers, but now they're not even in the marketplace. So of that $200 area, this amount is due to the sellers leaving the marketplace. That looks to be approximately, what is the area of that? It is 10 high, 10 wide, 10 times 0.5 is 50. Okay, what's the other reason for the decreased profits? These sellers number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, they're still in, right? They're still selling, but they're not making as much as they were before. So this area here is the fall in the producer surplus due to remaining sellers getting the lower P. So it's the guys who are staying there making less profit than they were before. The area of this guy appears to be 10 times 20. That's 200. Or no, 10 times 15. That's 150. Right? So there's 150 loss here. There's 50 loss here. In total, that makes the 200 loss in producer surplus that we talked about before. That makes sense? Basically the same as the consumer side. You just have to imagine yourself as a seller, not a buyer. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Very similar to the exercise you did with the consumers. Find the marginal seller's cost when quantity equals 10. Find the cost of the marginal seller. Then find the total producer surplus for price equals 20. Suppose price goes up, then that's a good thing. So producer surplus is going to go up. You got to decompose it. What's the new sellers versus the original sellers selling it for more money now? All right, let's do this. Okay, so at quantity equals 10, the cost of the marginal buyer is guy number 10, right? How much does it cost him to provide this product? Well, I simply go up to the demand curve. It costs him $20 to provide this product, okay? What's the producer surplus? If the market price ended up being $20, let's see what the consumer surplus would be. Well, this guy, actually guy number 10, how much producer surplus does guy number 10 actually get? Nothing, exactly. Because it costs him 20, he's selling it for 20, he breaks exactly even, right? But everybody down from him makes something, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So we go ahead and calculate the area of this triangle right here. 1/2 base times height. The base is 10. The height is 20. 20 times 10 times 1/2 is 100. Okay? Now, let's suppose the price rises to 30. Okay? Prices are going up. Now, you're a seller. Prices are going up are now a good thing, right? In the world of buyers, it's a bad thing. In the world of sellers, it's a good thing. Okay? So it goes up. Two things immediately you should notice happen, right? These 10 people are still selling, but now they get to make more, right? But you also notice that there's also guy number 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 that didn't used to be selling but are now selling, right? So they're going to get some profit as well. So let's go ahead and say that, yes, the total producer surplus is this big triangle here, but let's break it up into the two pieces, okay? The first piece is the additional people who start selling. There's 5 additional people who come into the marketplace, right? Okay, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And so this is the extra profit that they get from the higher price. And it's because they were never able to be in the marketplace before, and now they are able to be in the marketplace. Okay? But then there is the producer surplus on the 10 guys who've always been in here, right? And are still in here and are now able to sell it for more. And that's this thing right here. And it's 10 high, 10 wide, and it looks like it might be 100, 10 times 10. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and put this all together because I really want to know what's the welfare of the whole marketplace together, right? How the level of happiness of everybody who participates in the market. So I'm going to go ahead and have to take consumer surplus and producer surplus both into account and think about both of those. Okay? So remember, consumer surplus is what? The value to the buyers minus the amount paid, right? What's the consumer surplus to me? How much I value it minus how much I paid. Producer surplus, oh, and I mean the way to think about it is buyers' gains from participating in the marketplace. Producer surplus is the amount paid to the sellers minus whatever the seller's costs are. That's how much, producer surplus they make. Okay. And so another way we can think about that is sellers' gains from participating in the market. So if I want to know the total gains to happiness from participating in the marketplace, I just add up consumer surplus and producer surplus. I'll call that total surplus. Okay. At this point, I should make sure that I say something. I should have said this earlier, but I forgot. This word surplus is very different from the other time I used surplus in this class. Remember back in chapter 4 when we were like, oh, the price is too high, there's a surplus. That was a bad thing, right? It meant too many products. Remember that kind of surplus from back from chapter 4? I don't know why. I did not name this, but whoever decided to name this decided to use the same word and use a very different meaning, right? This is not extra, this surplus here does not mean extra products hanging around that can't get sold, right? Consumer surplus is the amount of happiness in their heart. Producer surplus is the amount of profit they get. Total surplus is the total increase in welfare that accrues to everybody who can participate in the marketplace. All of those surpluses have nothing to do with extra products hanging around. Okay? If you notice, doing some simple math, consumer surplus is equal to WTP minus the price, right? WTP minus the price. Producer surplus equals price minus the costs, right? If I add them together like I'm telling you to do, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, let's do that. I've got WTP minus the price, that's consumer surplus, plus price minus the costs, that's consumer surplus. Yeah, you see where I'm going with this here? Did everybody see how the prices cancel out? Minus price plus price. So what do I get? WTP minus costs. And that is actually what total surplus is equal to. So here it is. The total value to buyers from purchasing the good minus the total cost to society from producing it. Everything in between there is the total surplus, is the happiness that we can measure to all of society. That makes sense? And so then we can call that the total gains from trade in a market. Right? If I just look at whatever people value it at minus how much it costs to make it, that is the total gains from trade in a market. Okay? Value to buyers minus cost to sellers. Okay. So using that method of welfare, right? Let's talk about the market's allocation of resources. We want to ask this question. Say, look, does the market do the best job possible in making people better off? Right? That's the whole point in this question we're asking. We've just spent the last, hour and a half trying to figure out what does it mean to be better off in a marketplace, right? These were just building blocks to get to answer the question, which is, does the market make people better off? So then we're like, well, wait a second. How do we measure being better off? That was what consumer surplus. That's what all that other stuff we just did for the last hour and a half, right? It's to get to this point where we can ask the question, does the market make people better off? So the market's allocation of resources, remember what's the allocation of resources? How much is produced, Q, what the price is, P, who buys it and who sells it. That's what the market decides, right? The allocation of resources, meaning the PQ, who buys it, who sells it, is decentralized, meaning Does any one person decide what the price of candy bars is? No, right? It's a bunch of arguing between buyers and sellers until they get to prices that people are willing to pay, and then that's called the market price, right? Okay? It's decentralized. There's no one person who decides. It's determined by the interactions of many buyers and sellers who are self-interested. They're trying to get the maximum amount that they can. Buyers are trying to maximize their consumer surplus. Sellers are trying to maximize their producer surplus, right? So the idea here is, whoa, this sounds like a mess, right? There's no one person in charge. This is a bunch of people arguing over something together, sometimes in one place, sometimes over the internet, thousands of miles away from each other. There's got to be a better solution to this, right? There's got to be a way to make people happier than this the messy thing we call the market, which is just people arguing with each other, right? Or is there? So, is there a way to find something that would make us all better off? Okay? And the amount, and the way we're going to measure better off, right, is this total surplus concept. Okay? So, we're going to use total surplus as a measure of society's well-being. That's what I just said. And we'll consider whether the market's allocation is efficient, meaning if it makes the pie the biggest, if people are as happy as possible. This is a legitimate question, too. I mean, you and I have always grown up in a market economy, a place in the United States where there's no one person who sets prices or quantities, right? But when you look at the world and at our country and the rest of the world, you see people who can't afford basic housing or can't afford maybe basic food or something like that. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask and say, wait, what if we just had like the government control of all the prices, figure out what each stuff is worth, sell it for as cheap as possible, and then people get the stuff that they need or something like that, right? And so it's a legitimate question to ask. I want to throw out there that we're not going to talk so much about equality, equalness. Remember way back in one of the earlier chapters, we had talked about the size of the pie. There's one way to make your slice bigger. It's to make your slice actually bigger. The other way is just to make the whole pie bigger. We're just going to talk about making the pie bigger, not changing the size of slices. That's all we're doing here. Okay, so let's develop this concept of efficiency. Okay, this is a pretty specialized economics word, so you have to remember the definition of it specific to this class. Okay, total surplus, don't forget, is value to buyers minus the cost to sellers. That's this right here. It's just a reminder. So if we're going to define something as efficient, meaning the biggest pie possible, another way to think of it is that there's no way to make total surplus bigger. All right? If it's got the maximum possible total surplus, we'll call that efficient. Okay? In order for something to be efficient, it needs to have these characteristics. So these are characteristics that we need for efficiency. First, the goods are consumed by the buyers who value them the most. All right? It'd be no good to give, a very expensive hamburger to someone who's a vegetarian, right? They wouldn't value it, right? But if there's a guy over here starving and there's a vegetarian over here, it would make no sense to take that hamburger and give it to the vegetarian and not to the starving guy over there who loves hamburgers, right? That would not be efficient. Does that make sense? So first of all, we need this to happen. If something's going to be efficient, we need this to happen. Second, the goods are produced by producers with the lowest cost. This is similar. In order for something to be efficient, we need this to happen. It makes no sense to have somebody who's not really good at making hamburgers, and it's very costly for them to make hamburgers, make this hamburger. I'd just rather have somebody who's an expert in making hamburgers make this hamburger, and they can do it quickly, and they can do it low cost, and they can do it deliciously, right? That's what we want. And finally, we want to know that in a place that's efficient, it has to be true that if you made higher quantity or lower quantity, it would not change. Total surplus would go down. Efficiency has to be the quantity that maximizes total surplus. If any of these three things are not met, the point that we're thinking of is not efficient. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the market for shoes. We'll put the supply and the demand curve both together on here like we know how to do. And you know how to find this. What's the market equilibrium? 30-15, right? Okay. Just any place that lines cross. If you guys continue in economics, let me tell you, anytime you look and you see two lines crossing, you're going to be like, ah, you're going to be all happy. That's all we do is look for places where two lines cross. Okay. Let's evaluate this equilibrium. Okay, let's think about the terms of how much producer surplus, how much consumer surplus, all that kind of stuff. Okay, we find consumer surplus up here. Yes? Anybody see that? Do you remember where the consumer surplus? Where's producer surplus going to be found on this guy? Yeah, the bottom triangle, right? Between price and supply from 0 to Q. Okay, so that's producer surplus. And so total surplus is just that whole area there. Right? Yeah, just add it up, which basically is the gains from participating in the market, the increase in welfare from participating in the market. Okay, that red triangle is the total surplus. So now we're going to ask this question: is this point 30-15? Is it efficient, or is there a better place that we could make stuff? Right? What if the government stepped in and said, "Whoa, this is a mess. You guys are arguing with each other over this, and you came out to $30 for a pair of shoes and 15,000 shoes. It's time for the government to get involved and help regulate this market, right? Maybe set a maximum price for the shoes or something like that, right? Well, remember, the first thing is the people who get the good need to be the ones who value it the most, right? We want, whatever sort of way we decide to produce this, we want it to be true that the hamburger does not go to the vegetarian, but it goes to this guy over here who's starving and he really wants a hamburger, right? So we're going to ask the same question here. Who are the people who get the shoes in this marketplace, right? Well, it's these people right along here, right? Along the demand curve that there's 15,000 of them. Anyone who values the shoe more than $30 will buy the shoes, right? This person down here, he only values shoes at $10, right? Maybe that's me. I really like to be barefoot all the time. You don't want to give shoes to me, right? You want to give shoes to these people up here who really value them. Maybe they have jobs that need closed-toed shoes, or maybe they need steel-toe boots, or something like that, right? It would not be efficient to give a pair of shoes to me, who I really like walking around barefoot all the time, and then some factory worker not to have shoes, right? Because he's going to need them. Does that make sense? So the first key for efficiency is we want to make sure the people who value the good the most get the good. Well, it's true. Everybody whose WTP is more than 30 buys it. All of these people down here, they don't end up buying the good, right? They don't end up buying the shoes, okay? So it is true. The people who value the goods the most get the good. Check. That's good. That's a positive aspect of this market allocation. So that was piece one to efficiency. What's the other piece to efficiency? Or part two, I guess there's three of them. Who remembers? There was the people who want the good the most get it. What was the next part? It had something to do with sellers. The lowest cost sellers, right? Okay, so let's ask this. Which sellers produce the good? We only want the lowest cost sellers to produce the good. We don't want people producing the good, maybe some like old inefficient factory or some bureaucratic nightmare that's inflating costs, right? We want lean companies that can produce high quality products for low cost. Now this is what we're going to ask. Who are the people who are producing these shoes? Everybody whose cost is less than the $30 will produce the shoes, right? Which 15,000 sellers are producing the shoes? It's these guys down here, right? Who are the people not producing the shoes? They're these people up here, and it's the people whose cost is greater than 30, right? We actually don't want them producing shoes because if I could have shoes be delivered to my society that are made more cheaply, I'm not talking about poor quality. I'm talking about the exact same shoe One person makes it more expensive, one person costs them cheaper. Let's have the cheaper person make the shoe. It'll be better for everybody else, right? We'll have more income to spend on other things. Okay? Unfortunately, these guys are going to go out of business. Yes, that's kind of sad. But if they're being super inefficient, it's probably time for them to go look for a new sector of employment and something that they can have an advantage with, right? These guys, they just don't have any advantage in making shoes. We don't want them to make shoes, right? So the sellers with the lowest cost produce the good, right? That's a positive thing. So we know it's efficient. And finally, the equilibrium has to be at the place where the surplus is maximized. And if I moved quantity at all, it would make our total surplus go down. So let's look. At quantity equals 20, right, that's this point. Really, 15 is our equilibrium quantity, right? But let's suppose that the government came in and is like, oh, let's actually have everybody make 20,000, right? This is a mess, this arguing between buyers and sellers. Let's have the government come in, regulate it. We got 20,000 people who need shoes. So let's make everybody make 20,000 shoes, right? Let's just suppose, right? They're like, 20,000 little kids out here. We need some more shoes. Okay? Well, what's the cost? What's the marginal cost from guy number 20 to make a pair of shoes? $35, right? At the same time, though, how much do people value that 20th shoe? At $20. Do you see that? So seller number 20, it costs him $35 to make the shoe. Buyer number 20, he only wants the shoe for $20 worth. So if you force this guy to make a shoe and you force this guy to buy a shoe, that's not good for our society, right? The cost to society is $35. The benefit to society is only $20. We're going to have negative 15 in surplus. Okay? So what we should do is reduce quantity. We don't actually want to make that 20th shoe, do we? Because it makes negative $15 in surplus. Everybody understand that? So we get down to 15. Let's suppose that somebody said, oh, there's too many. Let's go ahead and try 10. Conclusion, sorry. Anytime the quantity is greater than 15, we want to lower the quantity in order to make the total surplus go up, right? That's the only, this is the last place, 15 is the last place where the supply curve is under the demand curve. Everywhere over here, the cost is more than what people value it at. So it's no good. All right, let's suppose that we go down to $10, okay? How much does it cost to make the shoe? $25, right? How much do people want the shoe at? Well, $40, right? Well, that's a good thing, right? People want the shoe at $40, it only costs $25 to make it, so we have $15 in consumer surplus, right? So that's awesome. But the fact of the matter is that shoe number 11 and shoe number 12, they all will have positive things as well, right? So if I don't let them make shoe number 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, we're going to lose a lot of consumer total surplus, right? So I want to go ahead and increase Q all the way up until the equilibrium quantity of 15. Okay? So I can't actually, anytime I move my Q away from the equilibrium place, my total happiness, my total surplus is going to go down. Right? Okay. Does it maximize total surplus? Well, absolutely, it does. The market equilibrium quantity maximizes total surplus. Any other quantity besides 15, your surplus is going to be lower. In other words, this is an efficient outcome, right? We saw that the people who wanted the shoes the most got them. The people for which it was the cheapest to make the shoes made them. And any other quantity led to lower total surplus. Okay? So we have the three characteristics of efficiency, meaning if we just go ahead and let this be the equilibrium, even though it was this weird mess of just people arguing with each other, there's actually no way that we can make the pie any bigger. Okay? And that's this guy thought. Anybody ever heard of Adam Smith? We call him the father of economics. He had this book. General Inquiry into Prices and Wealth of Nations or something like that. It has a long title. People just call it the Wealth of Nations for short. 1776, what else happened that year? Declaration of Independence, yeah. Columbus sailed, I don't know. No, yeah. It's definitely a Declaration of Independence. And he says this. People back then spoke a little weird, so I'll explain this. Man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. In other words, we need help from other people, and they're not going to help me just because they're nice. Okay? He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires for them. In other words, I need help. People aren't going to help me just because they're nice to me. If somehow I can make you think that it's in your best interest to help me, guess what? You will help me, right? He calls it his self-love, right? We all know that you're going to try to do what's best for yourself. If it just so happens that doing best for yourself is what I need you to do, then I'm on to something, right? This guy's very smart. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest, right? He's like, I'm not going to get meat from the butcher. I'm not going to get beer from the brewer. I'm not going to get bread from the baker because they're nice to me, right? They're not going to get from their benevolence. They're going to give me my dinner because I'm going to make it better off for them to give me their dinner, i.e. I'm going to pay them, right? And it's going to be better off for them, okay? So every individual, and here's the really, really interesting point. Every individual neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it, right? So all of us here, we're all just trying to do what's best for our own self. We're not trying to do what's best for society as a whole. We're just trying to do what's best for our own self. I guess he kind of understood how selfish we all sort of are, right? But guess what? He intends only to his own gain. He only tries to help himself out. But he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. In other words, a bunch of people getting together, arguing about prices and quantities and who buys and who sells, even though they're not trying to do what's best for society, they end up doing what's best for society by only looking after their own selves. Does that make sense? And that's kind of what I showed you in those last couple slides, right? In the marketplace, where the supply and demand curve crossed, it just, nobody set that price or quantity, but it just so happens that that price and quantity, society's total surplus is maximized, okay? Amazing insight. Not always true. We'll go into the times when you definitely need government intervention or when you need people trying to help out society. But under a set of assumptions of the competitive market, it's true. And this is really amazing. That hands off, don't do anything, it's actually the best possible outcome is going to happen. Just letting people argue with each other. Under a small set of assumptions, okay? So we'll call that the case for the free market, which is just let people do stuff, let them all argue with each other, versus government intervention, where the government tries to set prices or quantities, right? Okay? So we've seen that the market equilibrium is efficient, meaning the market all by itself, people arguing with each other, is efficient. Biggest pie possible. No other outcome achieves higher total surplus, right? So the government can't make the marketplace better off. If the marketplace is already working the way we've discussed it in our supply and demand curves, the government can't make it better off. This is very interesting. Okay, this is the notion. This notion is called laissez-faire. It means let them do it. Right? It's French. And so it says that government should not interfere with the market. Perhaps you've heard this, laissez-faire. It's a good time for you to learn it. You can throw it out there. But it means that the government cannot improve upon an outcome. In the example that I showed you just a couple minutes ago, in the market for shoes, it was true. There was no way to make the outcome better. This is not always right, okay? And I'll show you later in later chapters in this class. I'll show you times when it's not right, okay? But under a set of circumstances, it is right. Okay. So let's compare free market versus central planning. So let's imagine that resources were allocated not by the market, but by a central planner who cares about society's well-being. Okay? We're not super used to this, but it's been tried in history before, right? We have kind of the socialism idea from the USSR back in the day, back with Marxism and Stalin and Lenin, right? We have the Great Experiment, Mao Zedong in China, I think it was in the 1940s, right? Even Kim Jong-un in North Korea, I think that's who's in power right now, is sort of operating under this idea that one person or one man can plan a country better than the whole market just arguing at each other all at once, right? And so without thinking about this really deeply, it might be true. Like if you're like, what if I really cared about my citizens, maybe my city or my country or something like that, right? And I just sat and I thought, what would be the best price and what would be the best quantity and who should get these goods and who should make the goods. And it was just someone who really cared about it. Okay? That's called centralized planning. All right? In order to do this, and in order to maximize total surplus, the planner, what are the kind of things you need to know? You need to know every seller's cost. You need to know every buyer's WTP for every good in the entire economy. This is prohibitively large amount of information, right? First of all, you can't know everybody's WTP. How do you find out people's WTP, right? How could you do that? You just ask them, what's your WTP? People are going to lie, right? They're like, how much are you willing to pay for a cheeseburger? People, instead of being like, maybe they're really willing to pay for $10 for it, they'd be like, oh, only 2 cents, I'm sorry, right? So now you have to give it to me for 2 cents. People aren't gonna be honest. I think the only people who've ever been successful in figuring out everybody's WTP is eBay. You know why? Have you guys ever bid on eBay? So you have a product, and on the side it says place bid, right? And that bid number, what is that bid number that you put in there? How much you're totally willing to pay, right? You actually enter your WTP into eBay. Do you ever actually normally have to pay that WTP? No. People bid up, it just gets up until the price, right? You pay a market price that's less than your WTP, right? eBay's genius. They're the only people that I think have gotten an entire country to truthfully report their WTP, their willingness to pay, right? They're the only people that actually know our WTPs is eBay. But besides that, nobody else does, and certainly the government doesn't, right? So the government doesn't know who's got the highest WTPs, so they definitely don't know who should get goods or who shouldn't get goods, right? We see in, for example, in China and in North Korea, the people who end up getting the goods are not the people with the highest WTPs. They're the people who like have insides, you know, political connections or something like that, right? So it can go really wrong. And so centrally planned economies are never very efficient, actually. Great step backwards, often. Okay, so basically, the idea here is that we used welfare economics. Remember, welfare economics. How are people doing? Study of that. To look at this. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Usually, we want to just let markets go. Again, don't forget that there are times, and this is wrong, and I will show you them in later chapters. But in general, if we get a marketplace that's working fine, many buyers, many sellers, like a swap meet, we don't want any sort of government involvement. Okay? This is what I was saying. We derive these lessons assuming perfectly competitive markets. Later chapters, I'll tell you the fact when this breaks down. Okay?